allow me to welcome everyone to the last of this year's religion forums, and thank everyone for their support and of the religion forums up to this time. We're excited. Many of you know, we saw the list of forums for the year, that this particular forum wasn't part of the original plan. But Steve Downs was scheduled to be here a couple of years ago, 2014, in our religion forum series at that time. Because of medical reasons, he was unable to be with us, and so we're excited. We are definitely excited to have him here at this time, and glad that we were informed that he was in the area, and we were able to work out our schedules to bring him in today. So we're really excited about that. Rather than introducing our speaker, because essentially all I would do is just read what's off the sheet, I've asked, she's a Decorah resident. She spends half of her time here in Decorah, half the year in Decorah, and half the year in Florida. But she also serves as the education chairperson for the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. Right? So she's a kind of education, responsible for the educational arm of the organization. Mel Underbody. And so I've asked Mel if she would be gracious enough to introduce Steve and tell us a little bit about how they came to know each other and this Decorah connection. So at this time, I want to remind everyone that there will be a time of Q&A afterwards and a reception in Quality Lounge, which is directly across the hall. So Q&A can go on here, and after Q&A finish here, we will continue the conversation in Quality Lounge for some light refreshment. And so everyone is invited to be with us at that time as well. Having taken care of all of those administrative, logistical things, at this point we'll turn it over to Mel Underbody, who will introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you. So yeah, just to let you know, I'm a native here. I grew up in Burrow, and my father went to Luther College, and I went to Luther College, and my son graduated from here. So, as I grew up in Iowa, I started thinking that our government was looking out for us all the time and taking care of us. I moved to Florida, and that's where I met Samuel Arian, who was a tenured professor. We were colleagues at USF. He was a tenured professor there, and he's indicted for terrorism, and he was put into solitary confinement for 2.5 years before his trial. And I was shocked. Okay, so that's where I started. And I became it was Sammy's brainstorm, was this National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedom. So it really started in Tampa, Florida. And about a year later, Steve Downs, who was an attorney from New York, was having a very similar story happen to him, which he'll be telling you about. And he was our former executive director. So I've known him now for quite a while, seems like forever. So, he's going to tell you some really interesting things about some of the cases that we have been dealing with that are similar to Sammy's. Just so you know, Sammy was found innocent by the jury. He still spent another 8 years, I believe, in confinement. He spent a total of 10 years, 5 years mostly in solitary, 5 years in house arrest, and then he was deported. So he won his case, but he lost his case. He was deported. His 4 grandkids are here, and they don't have grandparents anymore. They're all under 4 years old. So, and now let me introduce Steve Downs.
Thank you all. Really pleased to be here with Luther. I've heard so much from Mel about the college and its distinguished history, and particularly its distinguished religious department. And so I'm really kind of honored and a little nervous to be talking to you about this today, because you have some experts here, and I rely a lot on the expertise from places like Luther to kind of direct us in this strange new world that we are finding. I want to just start with a story. It's a story about a little country called America. It was founded, and people came from all over the world to live in it and to build communities and to start their life over, particularly maybe escaping from religious persecution. And of course it was ruled by Britain. And Britain, being a colonial power at that time, the purpose of colonies was to enrich Britain. And there were certain conflicts that developed. And so America claimed its freedom. It had its revolution. It broke free from the British rule. And in doing that, they said, look, the kind of abuses that we suffered under the British, we don't want to ever have again. We don't think anybody should. In our Declaration of Independence, we are going to boldly proclaim, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, all men and women are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But as we were proclaiming that, in the back of our mind, there's a secret little voice whispering in our ear. Okay, that's fine, that's fine. But just remember how the real world works. The real world works by having tribes. And one tribe, what one tribe takes from us, we lose. It's a zero-sum game. So, out there, when we're talking about equality, sure, our tribe, the white man's tribe, is going to be equal. But we don't necessarily have to treat the other tribes exactly equally. All men are created equal in our tribe. We don't have to recognize that equality in other tribes. All other tribes are, no, all men are entitled to respect and dignity in our tribe. But we don't have to necessarily respect that in other tribes. We can humiliate them and bully other tribes. All men are equal before the law in our tribe. But in other tribes, we can apply collective guilt. And so we have kind of a two-brained theory about how we approach it. On the one hand, we have very high universal ideals. On the other hand, we have a sort of practical way about the way the world runs. And we have our own little tribes and our interests, and we're going to struggle with other tribes about that. So one of the first things we did was we had to work out negotiations with the Native Americans. And we found that they were a weak tribe. And we didn't have to follow our promises. We could break our promises and we could take their land, and there wasn't much they could do about it. And we did it, although we are not treating them equally. And then, of course, there were slaves in this country, and we fought a civil war to free them, and they became as equal as the rest of us. But in our tribe, we saw that they were weak. We could exploit them. We did not have to treat them equally, and we didn't do it. And the dichotomy in the brain of saying, on the one hand, oh yeah, you're just as free as the rest of us, and on the other hand saying, yeah, but you're not entitled to vote, you're not entitled to do, and there's a whole list of things that we say you can't do because you're weak, and we can pick on you. And then a lot of immigrants came to this country. And again, we went through that same process of denying people basic rights simply because they were weak and we could pick on them and exploit them. And a bunch of people came over from Europe with some crazy ideas about sharing everything equally between us. Communists and anarchists and socialists. And we said, boy, we really don't want that. This is a group of people we really want to get rid of. And so, again, we could pick on them. They were politically weak. And in World War II, we were fighting the Japanese, and we needed some way to express how strongly we felt about it, and so we could pick on the Japanese Americans out on the West Coast. We could intern them in camps. People with only 1/16 Japanese blood, who were American citizens, who had been American citizens for generations, but we could take them and order them put in concentration camps in the middle of the United States because they were weak and we could do it. And it satisfied our tribal need to be strong. And after the war, the Second World War, we began, the dominant tribes, began to make war against other people in places like Vietnam. And the other tribes in the United States objected. They said, why should we fight the white man's war? It was the time of the 60s, and there was the Black Panthers, there was the American Indian movement, and there was, of course, the Vietnam War protesters. And so during that time, the FBI started a program called COINTELPRO. Probably you are all familiar with COINTELPRO. But it was an illegal program designed to disrupt and to destroy the leadership and the movements that I just talked about, directed at people that were doing nothing more than protesting that policy by the United States. This was their legal right to protest this policy. And the FBI was training to destroy that ability. Now, it turned out, and they did some very bad things in that. Among things, they put people up on false charges and locked them up for crimes that they knew they hadn't committed. They disrupt organizations, they spread lies, falsehoods, and they even had some assassinations. Fred Hampton, Mark Clark were assassinated by Chicago police with the connivance and support of the FBI. And they were exposed, the COINTEL program was exposed in a particularly delicious way for me. They were exposed by people like you, average citizens, who went out and protested a very bad war in Vietnam and found that the federal government knew what they were doing and was disrupting them and spreading lies and was attacking them, and they could not prove it. They had no way to show that. And so one day a bunch of people got around together, and no different than you, and one of them, professor in Pennsylvania, said, "Would you be willing to join me in a burglary of an FBI office?" And amazingly, I think it was 10 people that he asked, and not one of them said no. That's incredible, and absolutely incredible. And so they planned very carefully. They went in and they did this fabulous burglary. And they got all the documents and they went out and they copied them in a farmhouse out back. If you ever want to read the book, it's a great story. It's called The Burglary. And they distributed these documents, and in the documents was proof, was evidence of the COINTEL program. And it was shut down. Eventually it was shut down. And later the church committee conducted hearings on it, and they said that COINTELPRO was effectively the government making war on its own citizens. And it was wrong. It should never happen, and it will never happen again. And they put in place certain procedures that would prevent the FBI from going off on their own to try to destroy perfectly peaceful protest. So that brings us to some 30 years later, and 9/11 came. And suddenly, our whole tribe, the white tribe, the American tribe, was thrown into chaos because we'd been attacked by somebody. But who? Who had attacked us? And our tribal response is, we have to attack back. We have to show that we are strong. We cannot allow another tribe to attack us like that. But who had attacked us? The people in the plains were all dead. Who was it? And so we decided to start a war on terror. This was a concept. It was not people. And this is slowly where I came into the picture. Along about this time, I was retiring as the chief attorney for the Commission on Judicial Conduct in New York, investigating bad judges. And I heard in the newspaper that they had arrested the local imam in our town in Albany, New York, and charged him with terrorism. And it seemed like a very strange case to me, so I volunteered for the defense team, and I worked with the defense team to represent him. And it was one of the strangest cases I've ever been involved in. There was an enormous amount of secret evidence, evidence that was shown to the judge, but was not allowed to be shown to us. In fact, at one point, we made a motion to see the evidence, and the government filed a response that was completely redacted. It was classified, so we couldn't see it. And within 2 hours of their filing that paper, the judge issued a decision that was also redacted and completely classified. We weren't allowed to see that either. So that was the kind of nature of how the trial went. And in the end, Yassine, my client, Yassine Aref, a very charismatic man from Kurdistan, was convicted, given 15 years. And I just will add one other little point. I don't want to go through all the craziness of the trial, but on appeal, we went up. We had a large number of issues that we raised that we thought would clearly get him off. And we filed our brief, and the government filed their brief. Then the government filed a secret brief that we weren't allowed to see. Then the government filed a top secret brief that even the local prosecutor wasn't allowed to see. We went into court, we had an argument, then we were excused, and the prosecutor had a secret argument with the court. And not surprisingly, the appellate court misconstrued every one of our arguments. But anyway, the point was that right after Yassine was convicted, the prosecutors were very proud of themselves. They'd done a great job on this case. And so they held a press conference. And one of the reporters asked the prosecutor, he said, you know, there was no evidence in the trial that Yassine had done anything wrong. Do you have any evidence that he was a terrorist? The prosecutor looked surprised and said, terrorist? No, we don't have any evidence that he was a terrorist. But he had the ideology. In order to preempt anything else, that's why we took this action. He had the ideology in order to preempt anything else. And that phrase stuck in my head. And so we began to talk about preemptive prosecution. The idea that somebody has said something or has an ideology or has been pointed out as a leader that might get a group together or in some way has raised concerns on the government. And that person can be preemptively prosecuted before they actually get around to doing anything. And that's why Yassine's case looked so strange to us, because there simply was no evidence that he had done anything. And we became much more aware of this as we went through. We began to find these preemptive prosecution cases all over the country. At one point, we made a wall here of the cases that we were dealing with. There's about 150 names on that wall. That wall was done a number of years ago. It's so old that I got a little blue marker over here. This is for Bradley Manning. Of course, it's now no longer Bradley Manning, it's Chelsea Manning, so you can see how old this wall is. And in the meantime, the number of cases that we're handling has probably gone up to about 1,000. That is, cases that we are following and that we are analyzing. So the number keeps growing of these preemptive prosecution cases. I will just explain a little bit about the kinds of preemptive prosecution cases that we have. One way that the government does it is to get an informant. We call them a snitch or a secret agent that they will insert into a community who will try to entrap people in various crimes that they can then charge. And there are a number of cases. I'd like to go through them all, but I really don't have time tonight to do it. But I would just mention, for example, one case was Tariq Shaw. Tariq Shaw was a famous jazz musician. He played at Clinton's inaugural. Today, if you go up on the internet, you see he has a website there. And he, for some reason, and it's not at all clear why, the government thought that maybe he knew how to send money to terrorist groups abroad. So they sent in an informant who tried to get him to send money to terrorist groups, and he said, I don't know how to do that. Well, the FBI didn't want to settle for that. So they sent in another informant. And this guy was really good. He knew how to get people. So he went to Tariq and he said, listen, brother, can you teach me how to play the bass? You are so good at teaching people how to play the bass. So Tariq says, sure. So he took bass lessons from him for a number of months. And then he said, brother, I no longer have a house. I've lost my apartment. Can I move in with you? And so he moved in with him and lived with him for a number of months and became his best friend, while secretly following him around with a tape recorder, trying to talk him into statements that could be used in court against him on a material support for terrorism charge. And he finally got it. Tariq was very interested in martial arts, and he always wanted to open a school. And the informant said, brother, I've got some people abroad who would love to help support starting a school. Would you be willing? And he said, sure. And he said, some of these people are from Al-Qaeda. Would you train people Al-Qaeda in martial arts? And he goes, sure, I'll train anybody. That's all it took. So he's now serving some 22 years. But I want you to consider the extent to which the FBI went to track this guy down and get him to say something that could be used. Imagine you are allowing your best friend to stay with you. And for several months, he stays with you in your apartment. And you learn later that he was following you around the whole time with a tape recorder, trying to get you to commit a crime. How would you feel? I mean, imagine the kind of treachery that you would feel in your heart from something like that. Another approach that the government takes is simply extraordinary enforcement of the material support for terrorism charges. Under the law, if you're not permitted to give material support to a terrorist organization, and of course we usually think of that as being money or guns or something like that. But the government has pushed us well beyond that to include things like free speech, free association, charity, even peacemaking. I have up on the board a group of peacemakers from out here in the Midwest. Some of you may know Jess Sutherland. I think she's from Minneapolis. I know her well. We used to work on some projects together. But at some point, their group wanted to try to bring peace in Palestine. They wanted to bring peace in Colombia with the FARC, and they were doing some negotiations. And the FBI came with battered rams at 5:30 in the morning, broke down the door, cleared out the house, took everything, dragged these people before a grand jury. What was the charge? What were they alleged to have done? They were alleged to have given support to a former foreign terrorist organization by trying to convince the foreign terrorist organization not to be a terrorist organization, to give up terrorism and become law-abiding. And that was material support for terrorism. And we have seen this continually. There is a lot of cases like that. Again, as I say, I wish I had more time to go through it. Some of the more bizarre cases, of course, Sandy's case and Yassine's case. One of the cases was Abu Ali. He was a very bright, very charismatic student who went to Saudi Arabia to learn some more, but he was at the top of his high school class. He was very popular. And while he was over there, for some reason, the government decided that he had become involved with a group that was planning nefarious activities. Supposedly there was some attempt to assassinate Bush, although there was never any clear evidence of it. It was all very vague, and nothing had moved forward. But he was seized by the people in Saudi Arabia and tortured until he confessed that he had, in fact, been involved in some group that was trying to assassinate Bush. He was then sent back over to this country with the tortured confession, and that was the only thing that they had. The only thing that the court had was a tortured confession. Now, in this country, it was fundamental. It went back to wherever, that you do not go forward with tortured evidence. You cannot do that. But they did it here. They simply said, oh, what does he know? Anybody could say that they were tortured. The stripes on his back, that's just normal skin discoloration. We don't think that he was tortured. We call an expert on practices in Saudi Arabia, and the expert said, oh no, we don't torture very much. We don't hardly ever torture. Even though Saudi Arabia was on the government list of states that torture. So he is convicted, and he is serving how many years? Life. Well, that's right.
14 years.
First he was sentenced to 14 years, and then it was raised to life on appeal. And there's a statement out here that we have by his sister, who described a little bit more of the case if you're interested about it. In any event, that was some of the background of what the kind of work that we did. We had to reach out to the families of these people. We had to reach out to find them lawyers, to work on briefs and make sure that people had some place to go to get advice. We would bring the families together from time to time and try to get them to talk about their shared experiences, because so many of them were isolated. They were, as soon as they were convicted of, someone in their family was convicted of terrorism, they were thrown out of the mosque. They were thrown out of their normal community. Nobody would associate with them. So we had to be the group that would find people that had similar experiences, who could start to share and start to heal and start to become empowered. And one other thing I should just quickly mention is that when somebody was convicted of terrorism, they imposed, the courts imposed very, very long sentences. The reason for that, there was a terrorism enhancement that quadrupled the normal sentence, so that what would be normally a maximum sentence of 10 years would suddenly become a maximum of a 40-year sentence. And because of this, a lot a lot of the sentences were effectively life sentences. And these sentences were to be served under very difficult circumstances. In many cases, they were sent into solitary confinement and would spend many, many years in solitary confinement in a tiny little box, not being allowed to leave, which has been found to be torture. The UN has declared this to be torture. One of the things that they tended to do was to often pick on people that had mental illness. And people with mental illness, of course, could be easily manipulated into these plots. But they did very badly in solitary confinement. And very often, because they did very badly in solitary confinement, the guards would pick on them, and they would call them terrorists, and they would harass them and write them up for ridiculous things. We just had somebody, I knew his mother very well. She was a very emotional woman. And I don't know how many hours on the phone I had spent with her, but I used to write to the jails where Ahmed Farhani was serving out a long sentence. Well, actually a relatively short sentence for him. And asking, please let him take his meds, because if he's on his meds, he's okay. If he's off his meds, he acts crazy, and then people pick on him, and then he gets mad, and then he does stupid things. And sure enough, that's what happened. He was off his meds, and the guards picked on him, and he said, I can't take this anymore, and he was writing letters to everybody, to the warden and so on, and finally, when it continued, and nobody did anything, the jail did not do a thing, he hung himself. Now, he didn't kill himself. He was cut down, but he is potentially brain dead. We're still waiting on it. This is, again, one of these issues where we have to deal with families, and we have to deal with these kind of crises that come up. Now, that wasn't the only thing that happened, of course. Preemptive prosecution was bad, but a lot of other things happened. One of the things that happened after 9/11 was that Dick Cheney really wanted to start torturing people. Now, if there was one thing that was clear in the law, it was that you can't torture people. There are international agreements about it, there's domestic law and so forth. But he found a way around that. He simply got a junior officer, a lawyer in the Department of Legal Counsel, to write an opinion that said, oh yeah, there's no problem. Torture simply means organ failure. So, as long as you don't kill the person, as long as you don't have organ failure, you can torture as much as you want. Now, this is complete nonsense. It was an incompetent opinion. Everybody agrees this is an incompetent opinion because torture is very clearly spelled out in these various treaties. But what Cheney did, which was brilliant, he classified the opinion so nobody could see that it was incompetent. And based on that, they say, we have an opinion that says it's okay, we can't tell you what's in it because it's classified, but that's okay, you can go ahead and torture. And thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people all over the world were tortured by this. Eventually, the opinion was leaked. They realized that this was an incompetent opinion. Everybody was mad at John Yoo. They were going to disbar him. And then cooler heads prevailed, and they sent him off to Berkeley to be a law professor. Teach people how to evade the Bill of Rights. Another thing that they did was, of course, Guantanamo. This was indefinite incarceration and without charges. And of course, this, again, is an abomination from American law. You simply cannot do that under the rules. You're required to have speedy trial on the charges. But it was a form of torture. I was very struck by a statement by a man by the name of David Hicks, who was in jail in Guantanamo. He was from Australia. And he said, until I knew when my sentence would end, each day was a battle against insanity. It provided the only way out. And I said, wow, that really, in one thing, it just encapsulates exactly the evil of Guantanamo, because you never knew when you would be released, or if you ever would be released. And as long as you were being held in solitary confinement, every day was a battle against insanity. Because insanity would have been to lose touch with reality, to go off in your own world. It would have been the only way out of this hellhole. And that's what we were doing to people. And it turned out that of those people that were in Guantanamo, I remember the worst of the worst, about 80% of them, the government eventually decided, were completely innocent. There was never anything wrong that they had done. They had been simply sold to the Americans as terrorists, and they were not terrorists. And to this day, we continue to hold people at Guantanamo who have been declared innocent and can be released. what does that say about us morally? That we would take these people and hold them in jail under those conditions, knowing that they are innocent. It is completely unjustifiable. And then, of course, we have drone assassinations. It is bad enough that we send drones in to blow up some supposed militant somewhere in Afghanistan, along with a whole apartment building of people. That, of course, is a disaster because it gets everybody angry at us. You cannot randomly kill people and not expect that people will be angry at you. But one of the things that came up that was important was that among the people we were blowing up over there were American citizens who were not involved were not engaged in the battle. And blowing up American citizens raises all sorts of constitutional issues because American citizens normally are entitled to charge and trials and lawyers and appeals and so on before they can be executed. And here, we're bypassing all that by simply blowing them up. And there was the famous case of Alaqui, Ansar Alaqui and his son Abdul Rahman. Alaqui was a mom down in Washington. He was well known down there. And he was an American citizen. His children were well known, including Abdul Rahman. And he got into conflicts with the government and eventually went to Yemen. And while he was in Yemen, the American government decided they'd had enough of him, and so they just sent in a missile and blew him up. And it was interesting because his lawyers got wind of the fact that he was on the kill list. And so they petitioned the president, and they said, before you blow him up, could we at least have a hearing to find out if he did anything wrong? And the court went to court, and the court sort of said, basically, sorry, it's premature. You have to wait till he's blown up before you make, how do you know that he's going to be blown up? So, he was blown up. But then 2 weeks later, they blew up his son, Abdul Rahman. He was, I think, 16 at the time. And the question was, why did you blow up Abdul Rahman? What was he doing? He was not a terrorist. And I remember at the press conference, I remember seeing this because it was kind of highlighted in the evening news. The president's secretary said, oh, you know, we took the actions that we did, we assassinated him or we blew him up because he had the misfortune to pick the wrong father. Now, I think it may have been a joke, but nobody was laughing at it because to this day there's never been a clear explanation as to why they could assassinate a 16-year-old American citizen in Yemen who was not involved in any conflict whatsoever. So that's another kind of area. And then finally, I just want to quickly mention the massive surveillance program that has been put in. When I was growing up, we had a certain expectation of privacy from the government. That we could make certain calls, we could have conversations, and they would not be listened into by the government. That particular right to be free from search and seizure has gone. It is, I don't know how we will get that one back. That's going to be a real tough lift. But the one thing that seems clear about it is that even with all of this massive surveillance, it does not give us any particular protection. Repeated studies have shown that all of this massive surveillance, while it may be helpful to listen into Angela Merkel or other people that we want to listen into, it does not help find terrorists. And indeed, of the very, very few terrorist attacks that have occurred in America, the FBI was virtually absent in all of them. I think there's only one case, the Zazi case, in which they were even marginally involved. So, from all of this, we can say that America, after 9/11, went ahead and sort of destroyed a lot of the things that made us special, that made us say, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. Here we are targeting a particular religious minority with all of these various special things, and in the very breath, doing things that are illegal under the Bill of Rights. And it is particularly odd, I think, because the chance of a terrorist attack in America has been so small. There are statistics that say you have more chance of dying from furniture falling on you, or from interaction with a 2-year-old, or certainly a lot more than a chance that you'll be shot by a policeman. And I have to say that the reason I think why we do this is because there is a tribal fear somewhere that we have to be strong. We have to find these people. But we don't know who it exactly we are looking for. It started out as a particular group, Al-Qaeda, and then we got rid of Al-Qaeda, and it goes on, and we keep going on and on. And slowly, you see the Americans starting to say, you know who I think we're really after? I think we're after all of Islam. We're after Muslims. And that is, unfortunately, what I think has given rise to this wave of Islam that we're facing. Both President Bush and Obama said that the U.S. is not at war with Islam. But over time, there has been this creeping evolution among people that it must be Islam that we're at war with. Virtually all Muslim Americans have strongly condemned the attacks of 9/11, and increasingly they're assumed to be guilty. So, this is a paradox that is hard to understand in a way. And I think that the only way we can explain it is to realize that we're really operating in two different logical systems. One is a kind of a tribal system, and one is a universal system, and we bounce back and forth between them. But there is a kind of a paradox, perhaps, or an irony to this particular situation, because the very group, the Muslims, that we are demonizing and focusing on as the enemy that we have to attack, are in fact very close, are cousins in faith to the Christians and the Jews. I started out with a story about a little country of America, and I want to close with another story that I think has something to say to this whole situation. It's a story about Abraham, some 4,000 years ago. And this, the more you look at this, the story of Abraham, the more amazing this story is. This is a story about a man who had a vision some 4,000 years ago. And he had two sons, by two different wives, Isaac and Ishmael. And somehow in the process of who he was able to transmit this vision to these two sons, and they passed it down through their lineage. Through Isaac, of course, we have first the Jews, and then the Christians have come down following Isaac's line. From Ishmael's line, coming down, we eventually have Islam, Muhammad, and then Islam. And if you look at these two lines, what really strikes me about it is so surprising. I mean, I'm a father, a grandfather. I say things to my kids. I'm not sure that they pass them on to the grandkids. But I would be pretty sure that after 4,000 years, nobody's going to remember a single thing that I said to any of them. What is the chance that we would remember what Abraham said 4,000 years ago, and it would still resonate in our culture today? That by itself is amazing. But what is truly miraculous is that he would have two children, and both children on both sides would remember what he said and would pass it down, and it would become central to our civilization. Is this not miraculous? Is this not divine intervention? And what was this vision that was so incredible that it got passed down for 4,000 years on both sides of the family? It was the idea that there is only one God. There are not a whole bunch of tribal gods that fight with each other. You remember this story. There was these tribal gods in Ur that were all kind of collected in one place. And Abraham thought that this was ridiculous. You know, why are you worshiping dead clay idols? So one day he goes out and he breaks them all except the big fat one. And so later the elders come in and they say, Abraham, what do you know about this? I guess they figured maybe he would know something about it. And Abraham says, why are you asking me? Ask the big fat one over there. And they said, we can't talk to the big fat one. He doesn't talk to us. And Abraham says, well, duh, doesn't that tell you something about who you're worshiping? Why are you worshiping something that's dead? Worship the living God. The monotheism. And the theory, the point of it is that we are all children of this one family under the one living God. all of us have certain responsibilities to each other. We are not separate tribes that can just disregard each other and humiliate each other when we feel like. We are family, and we have to show basic respect to each other, and we have to treat each other with human dignity. That, to me, is what the point of what Abraham was saying, and that is the point of what was passed down. Now, it's true, the message gets blurred when religions themselves start to act like tribes. When they start to argue back and forth, and they miss the big message. But this is a story that I think we need to start telling. The story of Abraham, the story of the idea that our civilization is based on this story of respect and accommodation between a family. If people understood that, I think it is much harder to demonize and just to start acting as though we are tribalists. Like Donald Trump, for example, is a perfect tribalist. He's representing his tribe. And the answer to that, I think, is to say, you're not talking about our tradition. Our tradition, the Western tradition, is a tradition of tolerance and peace among the brothers and the children of Abraham. So I throw that out as a challenge, what we can do. And I guess I'll just end there and see if anybody has any questions.
Well, I'll ask one.
Yeah.
Are you not worried that representing these people who have been arrested, that you will be charged with providing material support to terrorists?
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm an old white lawyer. I just don't think there's any glory in arresting them. This is not going to advance the FBI. But I think it's an interesting question because it suggests that maybe I'm doing something I could be arrested for. And if you believe that I'm doing something, how many people here think that I'm doing something I could be arrested for?
Could be.
And of course, that is the whole point of it, because as long as we believe that we are doing something that we could be arrested for, even if it's not justified, we will be quiet, we will be silent. And I think under these circumstances, it becomes obligatory on me and on everybody else to talk, to speak out. Because that's the only way you can prevent this, this chilling effect of the government who is saying, in effect, we will act illegally. We have the power to do it. We're going to do it. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
If you think about it, you sketched in quickly and I think very well the kind of the history that the nation has experienced in this area. But it seems it's a little short on solutions. And I wondered that when you were speaking of the FBI agent, the junior lawyer who, Kay Cheney, I guess he wasn't the FBI, but whoever he was, apparently you knew that. I mean, somehow that was discovered. And in our world, exposure, information itself, is a very powerful device, much more so than it's ever been that way. And if you really wanted to raise this issue, maybe some kind of a active wing that would actually expose these things would have more impact than anything else we could do.
Are you suggesting another burglary? Just kidding, just kidding, just kidding.
Probably not.
Well, no, you're right. And for example, I just had a conversation with Mike German, who was a former FBI agent, who was asked to do certain things which he refused to do, like submit false affidavits and so on, in connection with some of these cases. And so he has since left and has joined the Civil Liberties Union, and now I guess he's with the Brennan Center. And I spent a wonderful afternoon with him just talking about this. And he is saying it will come out, it will be eventually exposed. You cannot hold the truth of what is going on here forever. But as long as there still is fear, and I think the fear is palpable throughout the country, you're going to find people who are willing to play the tribal game. And I think we're still a couple of years away from it. I've said, when I first started, I said this is going to be at least a decade before we're going to get to the point where we're going to start to have information that is going to start to unravel these cases and is going to start to take back torture, for example, and that kind of thing. So I think it's time. I think both Mel and I feel that public opinion is swinging away from this. We're trying as a people to get back to our roots, but it's going to take time. I don't know any other way to describe it. Yeah.
Steve, how do you prevent cynicism of the government from paralyzing you? The kind of work that you do. When you put all the pieces together, what you said, and you just add that to the registration system overseen by the DHS for about a decade, NYPD surveillance, you got FBI, you got entrapments and preemptive prosecutions and mosque infiltrations, you've got deportations, detentions, extraordinary renditions, extrajudicial killings that Obama administration has been quite good at. All sorts of circumventions of law and due process. When you put all that together, it seems like overwhelmingly that, wow, what can be done? I mean, it's this, what almost the word comes across in my mind is monster, right?
Right.
But you have dedicated the past decade very particularly to try and work within the legal system against a system that you have recognized has almost become rotten to its core, at least on this topic of terrorism. So how do you prevent cynicism from just saying, oh,
Well, as a lawyer, I think we've all agreed, privately, the lawyers that do this kind of work, that the courts are closed to us. They have been co-opted in the government. We call it lawfare, where the law is bent to serve the war. And we saw that with the Japanese internments. There's been a whole series of these lawfares. And that's why we cannot win these cases, and we don't, frankly, think that we will win these cases. But that's no reason not to do them. For one thing, I think it's important to establish a historic record, to be able to say, if you don't try, people will never understand why. And so the idea is to keep fighting on it. And I think that we are also convinced that the government has taken a huge power grab, probably bigger than any of us really understand. The surveillance issue is enormous. It has nothing to do with terrorism, but it has an enormous power grab that they just can't get rid of. And they cannot resist the temptation to use that power. And inevitably, when they do that, they will overreach. I think we've seen that over and over again. So I'm kind of waiting to the day when they overreach. And we go, gotcha, you went too far this time. Even the American public is going to figure this one out. And I think that's really what I'm waiting for, at least, is one, to establish a historical record. Secondly, to wait for that case, that moment, that aha moment when people suddenly, the emperor appears without any clothes and somebody says something.
Is there, the lawyers who work with this, and we talk about, you told the story of the guy who gained another person's friendship and moved in and all that taking and so forth. Right?
Kareem Shaw.
That's this kind of strategic planning, right? As you talk about this kind of overreach case, right? I'm reminded of Montgomery Improvement Association and the NAACP in Montgomery, and the somewhat very intentional, strategic, even though she pretended to not know, placement of Rosa Parks.
Right.
It didn't just happen.
Just didn't
Right.
happen.
The Claudette Colvin before, and kind of realizing, okay, this is, the quiet open wasn't the right case, right? And this kind of very strategic planning of creating an overreach case,
Yes.
right? I mean, the Rose Park was an overreach case that, when it happened, it's like, here it is, right? I mean, when I think about this gentleman's question here, I mean, are there any thoughts in, when you say you're waiting for this overreach case, in strategically placing an overreach case, creating an overreach case? This is the, I mean, you know, behind the scenes thinking, we know that this is inevitable, right? And I think that, you know, when you read the accounts of, you know, the attorneys at the time, Nixon and Rosa Parks himself, and again, the people that are part of the government improvement, that Rosa Parks didn't just happen that day.
No, this was very brilliantly thought out. It was very carefully planned, and I admire the lawyers involved in that. I just think that they did an absolutely wonderful job of working on strategically figuring it out. What's actually happened, I think, in this particular case here, is that although the basic idea goes on, that we will continue to basically terrorize the Muslim community by bringing these false arrests and by doing all of this other stuff into compliance. We want them compliant. While we've done all of that, the actual trajectory of what's going on is changing. There was a period of time when it was very much focused early on large groups of individuals training to do things. And then there was a sort of downturn, and I thought that they were going to maybe just focus on lone wolves. There was a time they were just focusing on lone wolves. And then all of a sudden ISIS came along, and now there's another whole surge of trying to stop people from going abroad. So that it's a little bit harder to get the perfect case right now, because the actual work is changing to meet the new situation that is evolving. I think the Center for Constitutional Rights might be setting up a case. We may have some cases that we can give to them, but I don't know that we're doing it quite in the same strategic way, because that was perhaps an easier way, because it was not as much of a moving target. It was more of a stationary target, and I think that is easier to set up. Right now, things are actually getting quite fluid. I think that's the best way I can describe it. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that piece, Guy, I mean, maybe I can pose the question of, so the nice, perfect case scenario with a good fact pattern, would it also involve a Muslim American, but a white Muslim American, and not a person of color of Muslim faith? And I ask that because we've seen white Americans who have actively gone abroad and engaged in activities that on the surface would be the provocation for anyone here in the U.S. or abroad that happens to also be Muslim American, but is a person of color rather than a white person.
Yeah.
I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is very, very racial. I agree. And people who are white are really treated very differently. And it's noticeable. We joke about it, in fact. So the government, I think, has been very careful not to do something involving white Americans, which might end up to be the perfect case. I think they are very much aware that if they go too far with white Americans, they're going to cause a problem. They went after the peace activists. They had a grand jury for years, but they never indicted any of them. They knew what would happen. This is, you're indicting cute white girls. What, this is going to be a disaster, a public relations disaster. They wanted to keep the focus on Muslims, and particularly on black Muslims, I think. And Palestinians, that's the worst. If you're a Palestinian, then you get it 3 times over. I think as long as they are focusing in that particular way, they think that they can avoid having the case that will blow the whole thing open and that they will have to back off. That's just my... For example, we've had any number of cases where we'd gone down and had a demonstration outside a prison to protest conditions under which somebody's being held or something like that. And very quickly afterwards, the person is transferred to another jail, or the conditions improve or something. They're very sensitive to how their actions are being perceived. So I think you're absolutely right on target there. But the overreach probably will come when they go after, well, for example, they've gone after some environmentalists, some white environmentalists. And there's one particular case, McDavid case, I'm sort of following, because this was a case in which they had a sting. They bought sort of a very attractive woman who went in there and said, oh, I love environmental activists who are willing to blow things up. Oh. And this poor guy McDavid was just in love with her, and he just thought he was the greatest thing. But she didn't want to hang out with him until he could prove to her that he could actually blow something up. And he sent her love letters and all this sort of stuff. And eventually, she got them all up into a cabin somewhere in the mountains and said, all right, I want to see the plan as to how you're going to do it. Then, only then will I love you. And so they came up with this plan, and then immediately the FBI came in and seized him. And his defense at trial was, I was in love with her. I was in love with her. What was I supposed to do? And the prosecutor mocked him and said, where is the proof? Where is the proof that he loved her? And he's just making that up. This man is a hardened criminal, blah, blah, blah. And so he gets convicted and sent off to jail. And a number of years later, some new prosecutor going through the file finds the love letters. And they had not been turned over. The government had lied. And it's sort of a ticking time bomb. And I think this is one of the cases because it involves white Americans in environmental activity, the government lying to lock some guy up on basically what they call a honeypot kind of sting. So, you know, I'm hoping that might develop into a test case. So, yeah.
As I'm reflecting on your tribal rhetoric, I'm sensing that the tribe that America most likely identifies, at least within the government, is white men. In that respect, moving forward within 2050, white men will be the minority. How is that going to change in the future then?
Well, I think, frankly, that's part of what's driving it. I do think that what formerly was sort of taken as a matter of course that white men are going to run the country is now definitely questioned. And I think you see this kind of insistence on strong leadership and, we're going to keep the Mexicans out, we're going to do this. I'm going to be the tribal leader. We're going to get this thing back to where it should be, where we're in charge and everybody else is subservient. That's the last gasp to me of a group that is going to have to change or perish. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's going to be a rocky road. I don't think this is going to be an easy transition. And I have to say the other transition that's going on right now is that we have a bunch of presidential candidates, particularly on the Democratic side, who are all pretty old. And we don't have a lot of youth coming in. And I see that as another switch that's going to happen. And all of this is sort of happening right in the middle of this, war on terror. And I think the war on terror has taken on some of those aspects of how are we going to have a flip over in terms of generations, new generation running the country, new gender running the country, new race running the country. These are all things that are causing a lot of anxiety, I think, by a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, so in regards to your comment on having a new generation come up, I am really hopeful about that as well. And at the same time, I think that people my age and younger don't really have a conscious memory of an America before 9/11. And so these civil liberty violations and the war in the Middle East and Guantanamo, that is our adult reality. And so even among my friends who are more aware, if not aware, of what's going on, that is the normal. So even though the rhetoric changes, administration to administration, these things that are harmful are seen as being inevitable and as being normal. So how do you think that we can address that just kind of assumption that this is how it's been at the same time as we change the rhetoric? Because I would really look for my generation to kind of make things better, but right now, the people I see is just kind of having this inherent worldview of these civil liberty violations.
I'm painfully aware of that. I often get up there in front of an audience, and I said, do you remember when we could, and people think, no, we don't remember that. Back up. I was amazed the number of people who had never heard of COINTELPRO,
Yeah.
who had never heard of Mumia Abu Jamal. How many people here have heard of Mumia Abu Jamal? Okay. Probably the most famous political prisoner in the world today, but I don't think anybody, you see, I would love to be able to get back and at least teach a little bit of that history so that people would have an understanding about it.
Since the opening up of Cuba, we want to hear about Dr. Shakur.
Well, yeah, right.
Since Cuba's open now.
Well, you want, we can go there if you want. I mean, that's the next hour when we talk about all the political prisoners who are still in prison.
Leonard Peltier.
I'm sorry, I got away from your question. How do we get back to?
Because how do we go about convincing people that that isn't the inherent reality of what America is? Because there's so many people that is the reality.
Yeah. I remember I toured with Glenn Greenwald once, and he used to talk a lot about what really happened, the real tragedy of it. Bush comes in and he just does a lot of things that are illegal, that are frankly illegal and outrageous and completely contrary to our values. And Obama comes in, the constitutional lawyer, and says, oh my God, this stuff is horrible, it's illegal, it's outrageous, we have to make it legal. And so he spent a lot of time legalizing this. And now you have both parties have essentially bought into this. And because both parties have bought into this, it's going to be really, really hard to change. And I don't think we'll get it all back. I frankly don't. I don't see surveillance going back to where we have an area of privacy, simply because the electronic stuff has advanced so rapidly. It's a matter of technology. Pretty much anybody can do it now. And I just think that we're going to have to think about it in a different way. It's going to require a different mindset. I hope we get torture back. I think torture is very, very corrosive. It destroys not only the people that get tortured, but the torturers and the country that sanctions it. And I don't think you can long last as a country if you torture people. It just is the last gasp of a dying regime. So I'm hoping that can get back. And so you kind of have to go through issue by issue and see the world is going to look different after this. Let's see what we can make it look like that would be at least better than what it is now, without necessarily having to go back to the 60s, the good old days. Yeah.
So just to make sure we don't all go out of here like, oh my goodness. And so there's a butterfly in front of your podium there. What gives you hope? Where do you go on a very personal level? What keeps you lifted up? What do you do when you need a sabbatical? How does it happen?
Well, first of all, I love going out and talking to people. Very often when I go out and I talk to people, people say, we never heard this before. And because it's true, the media doesn't cover it. They only cover what the government says. So, I mean, I feel good in getting somehow I feel I have a certain responsibility to have this information. If I don't get it out, that I've lost something important. And I think part of it also is that I have, over the years, I've gotten to really like the Muslim community. They're really wonderful people. And they put a lot of trust in us to stand by them and to help them. I've watched the kids of these people who are in prison grow up. Yassine had 4 children. They started out, they were just little kids when he went off to jail. Now they're graduating from college. They're very bright kids, and they have all sorts of wonderful aspirations. They are very positive. They're excited about life. They're going to do good things. And I think right across the board, I see all of these kids growing up after 10 years. They're all like that. I don't know any that are really completely sunk in depression from this. If they can be optimistic about the future, if they can see positive things, then surely I can do that. So I think it's the personal context. It's the evolving stories. It's being able to come back year after year and tell new stories about these folks. And be able to say, just because you go off to prison doesn't mean life is over. Amazing things happen in prison. People write books. They engage in discussions with other people. My client, Yassine Arif, became the lead plaintiff from the Center for Constitutional Rights to close down the CMUs. And we see his case going forward all the time. And we're like, yay, you see, go get him. You know, you're a prisoner now, but you're going after the government. We love that. So there are all these little side stories that take place. And I think that's what keeps me going. Does that sound better? I know what I do is the joke is I go around the country depressing people. It's not my guilt, but.
Well, I want to just remind everyone to please take an opportunity to.
I just want to say, one of the things that the National Coalition does is that we prepare commutation petitions for prisoners who are in jail. We have a number of commutation petitions outside, and we're asking people to sign in support of these commutation petitions. Commutations are basically petitions that go to Obama asking that he let the people out of jail, that they don't have to serve any more time. And for some of the people, it's very important because they've gotten very, very long sentences, and it's just they're under a lot of difficulty. So if you just would go out there and take a look at it, if you could sign those, I'd really appreciate it.
And please join us across the hall. You can shake Steve's hand and express appreciation and follow up with any other questions that you may have or find out more about the information that's out here. Is everything's out here or is it in your
I think the petitions should be right outside the door. You guys are such a knowledgeable audience. I tell you, I love coming up here because everybody in this town is knowledgeable.